What happens when war films from the 60s vanish from memory, even though they had the power to shock, inspire, or completely change the way we see history? This was the decade of massive epics. But hidden in its shadows are smaller, bolder stories that hit even harder. Some were too bleak, some too experimental, and some just arrived at the wrong time. Forgotten by most, yet unforgettable once discovered, these are the war films that deserve a second look. The Blue Max, 1966. Imagine a war film that lets you step inside the cockpit of World War I dogfights, not with Hollywood gloss, but with roaring engines and biplanes slicing across the sky for real. That's The Blue Max, starring George Peppard as Bruno Stachel, a German pilot desperate to win the coveted Blue Max medal by racking up aerial victories. Forget the noble Allied heroes. This one puts you in the boots of an ambitious German officer climbing his way through the clouds. The production spared no expense. Real vintage planes and exact replicas filled the skies, flown by skilled stunt pilots. Director John Gillerman and cinematographer Douglas Slocum shot it in widescreen CinemaScope, and the result is breathtaking aerial combat that still rivals anything digital today. These aren't miniatures or soundstage tricks. When wings splinter mid-air and planes spiral into the earth, you feel the danger. Yet beneath the spectacle is a story of obsession. Stachel isn't the polished aristocrat usually seen in war dramas. He's a commoner who will sacrifice anything for glory. Critics praised the visuals, but complained about the melodrama, and audiences at the time found it too cold. Over the years, though, it gained cult respect. Peter Jackson himself has cited it as an influence on his love of aerial filmmaking. Why it's forgotten? Probably because it doesn't hand you easy heroes or villains. Why it's incredible? Because it captures the insanity of ambition soaring high above the trenches. And it does it with a level of authenticity few films have ever matched. King and Country, 1964. Picture the mud of a World War I trench. Not the sweeping battlefields of epic cinema, but a claustrophobic dugout where life and death hinge on a courtroom verdict. That's King and Country, directed by Joseph Losey and starring Dirk Bogarde. The plot? Simple, but devastating. A soldier accused of desertion after walking away from the front, and the officer assigned to defend him. This isn't about flying flags or triumphant charges. It's about the system chewing up broken men. Tom Courtenay delivers a heartbreaking performance as Private Arthur Hamp, a weary soldier on trial for his life. Bogarde, as his reluctant defender, embodies the futility of fighting a war while upholding rules designed to crush the very men risking everything. Lucy, an American who had been blacklisted and forced to work in Britain, brings an outsider's bitterness to the material. Adapted from a stage play inspired by real cases, the film refuses to offer comfort. The trench becomes a coffin of mud and shadows, where the echo of shells outside underscores the absurdity of the trial within. When it premiered, critics admired its artistry, but audiences stayed away. It wasn't grand, it wasn't uplifting, and in the 60s, people wanted heroics. Today, it stands out as one of the most honest depictions of how war punishes its own soldiers. Forgotten, because it's bleak and uncompromising, King and Country is incredible because it forces you to confront what war does when the fight isn't against the enemy, but against a man's spirit. The Victors, 1963. War films usually march in neat lines, a beginning, middle, and end with heroes standing tall at the finish. The Victors tore that rulebook to pieces. Directed by Carl Foreman, it unfolds as a series of snapshots following American soldiers from Italy to Berlin. There's no single storyline, just fragments, friendships, betrayals, small acts of kindness, and scenes so grim they rattled audiences. Filmed in stark black and white and spliced with real newsreel footage, it has the edge of a documentary, but the soul of a lament. One moment shows camaraderie, the next exposes the cruelty of boredom, the collapse of morals, or the blunt indifference of survival. There's even a scene where soldiers casually use a stray dog for target practice, a moment so harsh it still shocks today. Foreman knew about systems that crush people. Blacklisted in Hollywood, he poured that bitterness into this film. Instead of polished heroics, he gave audiences grit. Unfortunately, it opened just days before President Kennedy's assassination. In a moment of national mourning, no one wanted to face a film that offered only despair. Why it slipped into obscurity, timing, and tone. Why it remains powerful. Because it strips away the illusions and shows war not as glory, but as a slow erosion of humanity. Watch it now, and it feels startlingly modern, like a film decades ahead of its time. Hell is for Heroes, 1962. War films often celebrate courage in sweeping gestures. Hell is for Heroes does the opposite. It drops you into the dirt with a tiny group of soldiers, cut off and forced to bluff their way against a larger enemy force. No grandeur, no big speeches, just raw survival. Directed by Don Siegel and led by a magnetic Steve McQueen, the film is stripped to the bone. Shot in gritty black and white, it doesn't even bother with lavish sets. Paramount slashed the budget so hard, the crew reused the same stretch of land for nearly every scene. Instead of breaking it, Siegel leaned into the limitations, turning them into a style. The result? A film that feels as ragged and desperate as its characters. McQueen's role is electric. Long before the age of the anti-hero, here was a soldier as sharp-edged and unpredictable as the conflict itself. Around him, a cast that included James Coburn and Bob Newhart. Yes, the comedian played it straight, balancing moments of camaraderie with constant dread. When released, audiences weren't sure what to make of its small scale and unglamorous tone. But over the years, it earned respect for exactly those qualities. It's lean, tense, and bracingly honest. Forgotten because it lacked spectacle. Incredible because it captures what most soldiers really face. Not grand victories, but the exhausting grind of holding the line with nothing but grit. Dark of the Sun, 1968. If you think war films of the 60s played it safe, Dark of the Sun will prove you wrong in minutes. Set during the Congo crisis, it follows mercenary Captain Curry, played by Rod Taylor, and his right-hand man Ruffo, played by Jim Brown. Their mission? Escort civilians and diamonds out on a train through a war-torn jungle. This is no clean adventure. From the first frame, the movie pulses with sweat, heat, and menace. The mercenaries themselves are nearly as ruthless as the enemies they face, and the violence by the standards of 1968 was shocking. Director Jack Cardiff doesn't flinch from showing brutality, betrayal, and the human cost of chaos. There's even an infamous chainsaw fight that cemented its reputation as one of the most intense war films of its decade. Critics at the time were divided, some calling it excessive, others dismissing it entirely. But filmmakers like Martin Scorsese later praised it, admitting it was one of the most violent films he had ever seen and a guilty pleasure. That's saying something. Why it's forgotten? Because it didn't fit neatly into categories. Too violent for mainstream tastes, too unconventional for traditional war audiences. Why it's incredible? Because it's unrelenting. It doesn't romanticize. It doesn't reassure, it drags you onto that train and makes you feel every mile of the nightmare ride. Beach Red, 1967. War films often stick to the outside gunfire, explosions, charging soldiers. Beach Red dives inside the minds of men thrown into chaos. Directed by Cornell Wilde, this World War II Pacific Front story begins with a brutal, amphibious landing. Marines storming a Japanese-held island under relentless fire. From the first moments, the carnage is unflinching, limbs torn, soldiers stumbling in shock. This was 1967, yet the intensity feels closer to Saving Private Ryan than to its contemporaries. What sets it apart isn't just the gore. Wilde used experimental techniques for the time: flashbacks, voiceovers, fragmented memories. Soldiers on both sides aren't faceless. They're given inner lives. You hear their thoughts about love, family, even small pleasures back home, contrasted against the horror in front of them. This personal perspective makes every loss sting deeper. The Marine Corps, unsettled by its raw honesty, withdrew support. The Catholic Legion of decency attacked it. Theaters slapped on restrictions, and censors cut sections. All of this only amplified its reputation as too much for audiences then. Today, it feels visionary, an early attempt at psychological war cinema, one that laid groundwork for how we expect modern combat films to confront us with both blood and memory. Forgotten for being too radical in style and too shocking in imagery, Beach Red is incredible because it was decades ahead of its time, unafraid to stare into both the carnage and the humanity within it. Lost Command, 1966. If you thought Hollywood avoided colonial wars, Lost Command proves otherwise. Based on Jean Lartigui's novel The Centurions, this film tackles the French conflicts in Indochina and Algeria. Anthony Quinn plays Colonel Raspagui, a hardened paratrooper who barely survives Vietnam in 1954 before heading straight into the fires of Algeria. This isn't just another battlefield drama. The film contrasts Raspagui's unbending ruthlessness with Alain Delon's younger officer, who struggles to keep some shred of morality, and George Segal's character, who crosses sides to join the Algerian resistance. It shows a war not of front lines, but of counterinsurgency, torture, and brutal urban combat. Directed by Mark Robson, it had the ambition to tell a sweeping story across two wars. But here's the catch: it came out the same year as the Battle of Algiers, a raw, documentary-style Italian classic that overshadowed everything. Compared to that masterpiece, Lost Command looked old-fashioned. Critics brushed it aside, and audiences moved on. Yet, returning to it now, you see a rare English-language exploration of France's colonial struggles, something American or British films barely touched. The performances are strong, the action sequences tight, and the moral questions still sting. Forgotten because it lived in the shadow of a greater film. Incredible because it dared to look at wars most audiences never wanted to confront, and did so with the sweep of a Hollywood production. Merrill's Marauders, 1962. Most war films show battles as quick bursts, victories snatched after dramatic charges. Merrill's Marauders, directed by Samuel Fuller, shows the opposite: the slow grind of exhaustion. Based on the real-life mission of Brigadier General Frank Merrill's unit in Burma, it's about 1,000 American volunteers slogging behind Japanese lines in 1944, enduring disease, hunger, and endless combat. Fuller, himself a World War II veteran, brought an unpolished authenticity. Soldiers collapse from exhaustion, drag themselves through jungle muck, eat leeches for protein, and fight on, because no one tells them to stop. There are explosions and firefights, but the focus is always on the toll, the sweat, the fatigue, the hollow stares of men who've gone too far. Claude Akins, Ty Hardin, and Jeff Chandler lead a cast of composites rather than specific heroes, which only adds to the impression that these could be any men, forced into an endless march. Chandler, in fact, gave his final performance. Here he was gravely ill during filming and passed away shortly after, making his weary presence on screen eerily real. Audiences at the time admired its realism, but found it almost too grueling. In a decade of spectacle war films, this one felt relentlessly punishing. Today, that very quality makes it stand out. Forgotten because it wasn't glamorous. Incredible because it captures the true attrition of jungle warfare better than almost any film of its decade. How I Won the War, 1967. A war comedy starring a beetle sounds like lightweight entertainment. But don't be fooled. Richard Lester's How I Won the War, with Michael Crawford and John Lennon, is one of the strangest, darkest satires of the 60s. The plot is intentionally absurd. Lieutenant Goodbody, an incompetent British officer, leads his men on a ridiculous mission to build a cricket pitch in North Africa. Along the way, soldiers die in slapstick fashion, only to reappear as ghosts. Scenes are painted in psychedelic colors. Characters break the fourth wall, and propaganda reels clash with battlefield chaos. John Lennon's role is small, mostly cynical quips, but his mere presence drew curious audiences. What they got wasn't fun, but unsettling. Lester turned war into surreal farce, showing the disconnect between officer-class optimism and the meaningless deaths of ordinary soldiers. At times, it plays like Monty Python with a cruel streak. When it premiered, audiences were baffled. Was it comedy? Tragedy? Satire? It was all three, and it was too bitter for mainstream success. But through today's lens, it looks bold, mocking not just war movies, but war itself, through absurdity. Forgotten because it confused people. Incredible because it dared to experiment, making a war film that feels like it escaped from a fever dream, but still cuts deep. Play Dirty, 1969. War films often give us ragtag heroes with hearts of gold. Play Dirty rips that comfort away. Directed by André Detot and starring Michael Caine, it follows a group of commandos disguised as Italians on a mission in North Africa to blow up a fuel depot. Straightforward setup, right? Wrong. From the start, it makes clear, these men aren't noble. They're pragmatic, ruthless, and when faced with civilians who might expose them, they don't hesitate. There's no moral pause, no noble justification. It's cold, it's sharp, and it feels far closer to reality than the polished tales of heroics dominating the decade. Michael Caine anchors the film with weary cynicism. Around him, Nigel Davenport and Harry Andrews embody soldiers who act first, think later. The direction keeps tension razor sharp, and the desert setting becomes as unforgiving as the men trudging through it. Critics at the time didn't know what to do with it. Coming in the shadow of The Dirty Dozen, it seemed like a lesser cousin, but in truth, it's meaner, tighter, and more unflinching. Martin Scorsese later nailed it. Play Dirty isn't sadistic, it's simply unsentimental. Forgotten because audiences weren't ready for its nihilism. Incredible because it stripped away the last illusions and showed war not as glory, but as raw survival played with no mercy. Too Late the Hero, 1969. By the late 60s, audiences thought they knew what to expect from a World War II jungle film. Too Late the Hero tossed that comfort into the fire. Directed by Robert Aldrich and starring Michael Caine alongside Cliff Robertson, it follows a reluctant mission into Japanese territory in the Pacific. The assignment? Destroy a radio installation before reinforcements arrive. What starts as a simple commando story quickly becomes a study in futility. The squad is mismatched, filled with tension, and plagued by poor leadership. Michael Caine plays the cynical officer who knows the mission is doomed, while Robertson embodies a by-the-book American who slowly realizes just how hopeless the task really is. The jungle itself becomes the true enemy, sticky, choking, and unforgiving. Ambushes strike, trust phrase, and what's left isn't a clean victory, but a grim countdown where survival feels less like triumph and more like delay. Aldrich, who also gave us The Dirty Dozen, refuses to sugarcoat. Here, the tone is darker, the ending harsher, and the commentary on wasted lives impossible to miss. Why Forgotten? Released at the tail end of the decade, it didn't have the showmanship of Aldrich's earlier hit and was overshadowed by flashier war films. Why Incredible? Because it's relentless. Instead of cheering you on, it strips hope away, forcing you to confront the grinding cost of conflict. The Bedford Incident, 1965. Not all war films are about trenches and battlefields. The Bedford incident takes place almost entirely aboard a U.S. Navy destroyer in the icy waters of the Atlantic, but it might be one of the tensest war thrillers of the 60s. Richard Widmark plays Captain Finlander, a hard-edged commander obsessed with hunting a Soviet submarine. Sidney Poitier, as a journalist on board, watches the obsession spiral into disaster. The brilliance of this Cold War drama is its claustrophobia. The steel corridors, the hum of radar, the endless expanse of ocean it builds pressure like a kettle ready to explode. Widmark's captain isn't portrayed as a villain, but as a man consumed by his own mission, unable to recognize when he's gone too far. The climax. One of the most shocking endings of the decade. Without spoiling, let's just say the escalation of tension leads to a moment that leaves the crew and the audience in stunned silence. Why Forgotten? Overshadowed by other Cold War thrillers of the era, it didn't get the love it deserved. Why Incredible? Because it's basically a ticking time bomb on screen, and it proves you don't need massive battles to terrify an audience. Sometimes all it takes is a single decision in the middle of the ocean. The Secret Invasion, 1964. Long before The Dirty Dozen stormed the box office, Roger Corman delivered his own twist on the convicts sent on a suicide mission formula with The Secret Invasion. It may not have had the budget or the star power, but it had grit and energy in spades. The setup is irresistible. Stuart Granger recruits a group of prisoners with special skills. Safecrackers, fighters, schemers to infiltrate Nazi territory and rescue an Italian general. The promise of freedom drives them, but betrayal and self-interest lurk in every corner. Corman, famous for making small budgets stretch like elastic, used clever location shooting in Yugoslavia and a brisk pace to mask financial limits. What the film lacked in polish, it made up for in nerve. Characters weren't just stock figures, they clashed, doubted, and sometimes sabotaged each other, giving the film an edge that big studio productions often avoided. Why Forgotten? Released in the shadow of larger war epics, it looked like the cheap cousin. Why Incredible? Because it's raw, fast, and far more influential than it gets credit for. You can see the DNA of later Commando classics right here in this scrappy little film. Operation Crossbow, 1965. Espionage meets war action in Operation Crossbow, a film that blends cloak and dagger thrills with explosive missions. George Peppard leads a team of Allied agents tasked with sabotaging Germany's secret rocket program. Sophia Loren adds glamour in a supporting role, but the real star is the tension. This isn't your typical battlefield drama. The narrative shifts between the Allied operatives and the German engineers racing to perfect their deadly technology. The film juggles suspenseful infiltration sequences with big action payoffs, and the production design captured the sleek menace of underground rocket bases. At the time, critics dismissed it as too pulpy, too glossy compared to grittier war films. But looking back, its blend of spy movie energy and war drama feels unique. It plays almost like a James Bond mission dropped into the middle of World War II. Why Forgotten? It never earned the prestige of the bigger 60s war spectacles. Why Incredible? Because it delivers thrills with style, and because it dared to merge genres before that was fashionable. The Hill, 1965. Not all war films show bullets flying. Some reveal the battles fought within the ranks themselves. The Hill, directed by Sidney Lumet and set in a North African British Army prison camp during World War II, is one of the most intense films of the decade. Sean Connery, fresh from James Bond fame, stars as a soldier punished alongside others by a sadistic staff sergeant who forces them to repeatedly climb a man-made hill of sand under a blistering sun. This isn't about combat, it's about cruelty, discipline, and the breaking point of men crushed by their own system. Lumet shot it in stark black and white, turning the desert heat into a visual punishment. The camera lingers on sweat, exhaustion, and despair, making every frame feel suffocating. When it premiered, critics admired the raw performances, especially Connery proving he was more than just a spy icon. But audiences expecting action and spectacle were blindsided by its bleakness. Over time, it became one of Connery's most respected roles, though it never earned the wider recognition it deserved. Why forgotten? Because it traded explosions for psychological torment, leaving mainstream viewers cold. Why incredible? Because it's a relentless exploration of authority, resistance, and survival, proving that sometimes the harshest wars are fought without a single shot being fired. And there, you have it, 15 war films from the 60s that history tried to bury but still hold power today. Some were too grim, some too experimental, others just unlucky with timing. But every one of them proves that forgotten doesn't mean forgettable. So which of these caught you by surprise? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit subscribe for more deep dives, and share this with someone who loves hidden gems. After all, rediscovery is half the fun. What will you watch next?